It is indeed a pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Harish Trivedi, former professor of English, University of Delhi, as the keynote speaker of this 2-week bilingual online refresher course on cinema, society, and education. On behalf of the IQAC of Atmaram Sanatan Dharm College, I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Trivedi. It is always a pleasure to hear him speak, and we are glad that he took out time for us to be the keynote speaker for this refresher course. Professor Harish Trivedi is the former professor of English, University of Delhi, and served as visiting professor at many universities in India and abroad, including the universities of London, Belfast, Istanbul, and Chicago. He is the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature and India, and is the co-editor of a number of books such as The Nation Across the World, Post-Colonial Literary Representations, Literature and Nation, Britain and India, 1800 to 1990, Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice, etc. Professor Harish Trivedi served on many respectable positions at various international associations. He was a secretary and the vice president of the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies in the Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies from the year 2002 to 2004. He was the visiting professor at the University of Chicago, USA, and School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in the year 2002. He has also delivered various lectures at various prestigious universities, such as the University of Georgia at Athens, University of Oklahoma, the University of Chicago, and many more. As a translator of hidden stories, a critic of literature, an editor of anthologies of Indian literature and collections of translational theory, and an author of translational theory himself, Harish Trivedi has worked hard to lead Indian literature to a place of pride for the people it represents. I invite you, sir, for your keynote address. Sir?
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Right, okay. First of all, I wish to say that you do me a great honor in inviting me to give the keynote address at this refresher course. It's a great honor, which I appreciate even more after having gone through the list of other speakers throughout this refresher course that you have gathered together. There's some filmmakers amongst them, some film critics, film specialists, and a number of people in other areas of specialization.
Sir, please unmute yourself. Hello.
Vinita, bolo. Sir, please unmute yourself.
Sir, please unmute yourself. Yes, sir. Fine, sir. Fine.
What happened? I was audible before.
Yes, sir. I think so. Something pressed there. I don't know what happened.
Okay, right. Am I audible again?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's what matters. What I was saying was that I feel especially honored because I've gone through the list of speakers, other speakers who are going to speak here. And there are people of great expertise and eminence. And I think at least 10 of them, if not more, would have been equally suitable, if not more so, to deliver this keynote. And therefore, my sense of being asked to do this is even greater. Thank you very much. I'm particularly grateful to Gantosh ji, who is responsible for my agreeing to come and speak today. I think I came and spoke at the ARST College 10 or 12 years ago. And I was hoping that that performance of mine would have been forgiven and forgotten, but obviously not. It seems that Gantosh ji remembers that. And he is therefore even more insistent that I should be here today. I must say that over the last couple of days, 3 or 4 days, I've not been feeling particularly well. And uh, I got some kind of an infection. But I can see that all of you are maintaining social distance. You're not only 6 feet away, but you are 6 kilometers or 60 kilometers. And there's some participants from South India, I understand, they're perhaps 1,600 kilometers away. So that's good. I may not have been able to make it in my present state had I had to travel to Air SD College. But in these new times, we have had new facilities as well. And this is one of them, that we can all sit at home and still converse with each other, still communicate. The topic that you have chosen is particularly fascinating. I must say that I've been to about half a dozen, maybe even 1 dozen conferences and seminars over the years, which had cinema in their rubric. And always, and on those occasions, there was cinema and there was literature. In fact, there was literature before there was cinema. That has been what we've been talking about in the kind of circles that I move in. And this makes a totally refreshing difference to have cinema in the title and no literature. This is an innovation. This is also a sign of the times. This reflects the increasing importance of cinema and it is capacity now to free itself of the modes of discourse and discussion which had always linked it to cinema as to literature as being, as it were, a kind of younger brother of literature. It has grown out of that status to be autonomous in a new kind of way. You have another important item in the rubric, which is education. That's the twist in the tail. It's not cinema and society alone, but there's also education. And this makes it even more interesting, even more fascinating to address this topic. Let me try and historicize the relationship between cinema and society and education in not only broad social terms, but also perhaps to begin with in autobiographical terms. Cinema is not all that old. In India, 1913, the first silent film, Raja Harishchandra. Alamara, 1931, the first talkie. So we have had a centenary of Raja Harishchandra, but the centenary of Alamara is yet to come. We still haven't had 100 years of talkies in our country. That's how recent it is. And therefore, it's possible to historicize in a fairly well-documented way the place of cinema as it has evolved in our society over these decades. The first example I'll give you is myself. Autobiographical episode from the 1960s when I was a university student at the University of Allahabad. As students together, one of the most wicked things that we could do was to bunk classes at the university and go and watch a film. This was, in those days, in those innocent days, the ultimate of doing something wicked, delightfully wicked, almost sinful. We were all made to feel guilty if anybody found out about it. And this was the ultimate transgression in our lives at that time. We could not think of doing anything worse. So the correlation between education and cinema in those days was that cinema was, education was the hero and cinema was the villain. That education is what we should have pursued, but we were instead attracted by cinema and we were absconding from education and going over instead to cinema. Now, even in the 1960s, and I think till even later, there was something tainted about cinema, about enjoyment of cinema. That was the common social attitude. That anybody who takes undue delight in cinema or delight of any kind is perhaps not serious enough, is perhaps indulging in a kind of escape, a kind of entertainment that can't be good. And this attitude continued for a long time. And we must recognize that cinema in its beginning was conditioned, or attitude in society was conditioned by these factors. The next instance that I wish to cite to you is the beginning of talkies and a hunt for talent that ensued at that time on the part of companies producing cinema, producing films, to try and put cinema in a kind of place, to give it a kind of status that would make it respectable, that would attract people to it and improve the quality as well, and so on. Those of you who are familiar with the history of cinema in our country would know that a number of writers, established literary writers from several languages were invited to write for cinema. And the attraction for them was that they were going to pay the kind of money that they'd never have dreamt of. Cinema was big money right from the start. And the one particular example that I wish to offer here is that of the Hindi novelist Premchand, Hindi Urdu novelist Premchand. Premchand was already of a certain age. He was already famous. He had already written all his great works except the last one, Godan, when an offer was made to him to leave Banaras and go to Bombay and write for films. Ajanta Cinetone was the name of the company, and Premchand accepted the offer. He was being offered 8,000 rupees for a one-year contract, which was very seriously big money then. And he accepted the offer and he arrived in Bombay in May 1934. It's a one-year contract. He stayed there till April and then he left, not because he broke the contract, but because the company itself was not succeeding. It was being wound up. What was his experiences in associating with films at a very early stage? Remember, the first talkie is 1931. Premchand is already in Bombay writing for films in 1934, within 3 years. Premchand, of course, apart from his major claim to fame as a novelist, also is famous in many radical circles in India across the languages, even beyond Hindi, as the person who delivered the first presidential address of the very first Progressive Writers Conference that was held in 1936 in Lucknow. So he is one of the founding progressives of Indian literature on the strength, not only of his fictional writings, but of that extremely stirring address. What did Premchand say about films then? What was his experience of films? In November of that year, November 1934, Premchand, while living in Bombay, read an article on the role of cinema in society written by Hashimuddin Gori, who lived in Hyderabad. And I assume that this article was published in an Urdu journal. I don't have further details because no biographer has been able to dig up the further details. And Premchand wrote a letter to Hashimuddin Gori, who was not famous while Premchand was famous. And what did he say in this letter? I agree, I quote Premchand, I agree entirely with each word of yours. But those who hold the fate of films in their hands, unfortunately, take it to be a business proposition, an industry. And what can an industry have to do with taste and its correction? All it knows is how to exploit, and is here exploiting even the most sacrosanct human emotions. Nude or semi-nude images, incidents of murder and violence, anger and oppression, rage and selfishness, these are the weapons of this industry by which it is murdering humanity. It's a very strong statement. And the statement is all against how cinema, because it's an industry, because the commercial motive is foremost in it, is murdering humanity, says Premchand. Even earlier, and I'll quote another passage, as soon as he had arrived there in May, and this letter is from June, a few days after he'd arrived there, his first impressions. He says, I arrived here in Bombay on the 31st of May. Since then, I've been, I can skip that about where he's going to stay. I cannot yet say whether I should even like to stay on here or not. Within a couple of weeks, he says that. It is a very fine place, Bombay, with clean roads and airy houses, but I don't like it here. The actresses here just wouldn't be able to enact the kind of stories I like. To play my roles, they will have to engage actresses who have had some education. For I shall go on writing my kind of stories. I can't write what they want me to write. It's a compromise with art. It's a compromise with any values that Premchand cherishes, and he is not willing to make that compromise. It's happening not only to Premchand, it's happening to a number of writers from a whole number of languages. I would say that in my knowledge, there are some languages whose authors were better able to accommodate themselves to cinema, or better able to influence its growth and evolution. And in some others, it was a mismatch. Example, there's a contrast with Urdu. So many Urdu writers not only went into cinema, but stayed there, were very happy staying there, and dominated the cinema industry, the so-called Hindi cinema industry, even though they were Urdu writers, because somehow their taste, their style of writing matched that was commercially required in cinema, even while many of the progressive Urdu writers also tried to influence the direction in which it was going. There was mutual accommodation between these writers and how cinema was evolving. What was wrong? Premchand says something about actresses. Why does he not say anything about actors? In our day and age, that might be noticeable. I think the reason is that the ancestry of cinema in our country, which derives from the Parsi theatre, and the kind of entertainment that the Parsi theatre offered, which was again equally a commercial enterprise. Only entertainment, only making money. Also, of course, the evolution of Parsi theatre in itself is a fascinating story. I've read about it, I've written about it over the period from Aga Harsha Kashmiri down to Narayan Prasad Betab and Radheshyam Kathavachak. There's a shift in the thematic evolution of even Parsi theatre over the decades. And that is the inheritance that cinema has, at least in Hindi. The actresses then had the kind of social standing. They were required above all to be able to sing and dance. And there was already a tradition of singing and dancing in the North Indian culture, which was associated most of all in terms of public entertainment with courtesans. That was one of the reasons why there was not only a prejudice against cinema in the early times, but also about his competence or even inclination to come out of that kind of public entertainment that had been popular before the new form of cinema came along. Umrao Jan Ada is an important text here. The woman at that time, as depicted in several different languages, a courtesan herself, and a very gifted, exceptional courtesan, not the ordinary run-of-the-mill courtesan. But even then a courtesan. And there are novels in other languages at the same time, roughly the same time, towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, which also depict the new woman in those languages. It'll be a very interesting study, and some people have begun to undertake this kind of the image of the woman, of the new woman, as depicted in fiction in, say, Urdu, Umrao Jan Ada, in Malayalam, Indulekha, in Kannada, Indira, in Hindi, which is a novel that comes even before all of these, in the 1870s, called Bhagyavati. So different languages carry different cultural genealogies of the image of the woman. And because entertainment in cinema is centered so much on the performing woman, therefore, there are all these considerations that arise that make cinema a reprehensible, tainted, corrupting form of what is not art really, but commerce. This is not only Premchand. Even a most enlightened and progressive person like Premchand is saying this. So just imagine what the others are saying. Now, this is where cinema begins. And this is where cinema continues. There were not only courtesans, there was another class of women who was also acting in major roles in Hindi cinema at least. And this was a foreign woman. That Indians would not do this, only foreigners would do this. That kind of cheap entertainment that was offered, in some people's view. Of course, there has been a major reassessment and revaluation. But let's also look at the contemporary attitudes to cinema in those times. How does it change and when does it change? That is why for a very long time, nobody who thought himself to be semi-intelligent, who thought himself to be educated, had anything to do with Hindi cinema. They were all going and watching it, but pretending that they did not. Pretending that they had nothing to do with it, that Hindi cinema was only for the rickshawalas. I've heard this said so often in my childhood, and that is why when I went to watch it with my friends, bunking classes, there was a taint. There was a kind of a kalank that I was going to do something that was morally corrupting, and still I was going. This was the attitude as I said for a very, very long time. Now, how does it change and when does it change? Because it has changed quite substantially now. I would say that it changes in the 1980s. And there are two developments that take place, and that is how the change comes about. One is that there is what is called a cultural turn in academics. That popular culture becomes respectable. Not only cinema, all kinds of popular culture becomes respectable, not here, but in the West. Now, the influence on us and our academia, or whatever happens in the West, is so profound and so imitative and slavish that when they have a popular turn, when they have a turn towards popular culture, then within a few years, we also have a turn towards popular culture. And this turn towards popular culture, called cultural studies, this is what redeems cinema, a very popular medium, from its image as being very low and almost wicked to something respectable and seriously worth studying. I remember Terry Eagleton, who is probably one of the most articulate Marxist critics of that generation, 80s, 90s, even 70s, reacting somewhat ambivalently to the emergence of cultural studies and study of a study of cinema at the same level as literature, for example. He said in a book, these days, a young man can sit down in front of a screen and get up 4 years later with a PhD. This is the kind of mocking attitude that even enlightened people like Terry Eagleton had towards the emergence of cultural studies. So that is one thing. Something else is happening in the 1980s, which is also very helpful towards the emergence of cinema as a respectable subject of study. And that is going alongside this cultural turn, that is the emergence of theory, particularly postmodernism, deconstruction, post-structuralism. All these have a say in deconstructing the value system, the so-called humanist value system based largely on literature that we had before that. On literature, on a positivist kind of history, that kind of thing. All that was shaken to the foundations by these new theoretical developments, and it was entirely to the benefit of any popular medium, including most of all in India, of course, cinema. I said earlier, right at the beginning, that cinema was seen to be a kind of a dependent, a kind of appendage to literature for a very long time. And this is reinforced by the fact that so very often people in literature departments particularly, study cinema basically in terms of adaptation of literary classics into the cinematic mode. That is one way of studying cinema, but then there's lots of cinema made that has nothing to do with literature so far as the source goes. So that was a bit unfair to cinema. And it has, of course, now attained complete autonomy, more or less. But look at what it has done in the process. From many of the pedestals of our culture, it has actually knocked off literature. It is standing alongside literature as equally respectable and equally attractive, if not a bit more so. And one very public manifestation of this is the so-called literary festivals that are held all over the world, particularly in India. At a place like the Jaipur Literary Festival, which are the sessions that are totally jam-packed. Those that have Javed Akhtar, those that have Gulzar, those that have Kajol, those that have Shabana Azmi. Those, I mean, are they literature? Are they literary? Are they part of literary festivals? Yes, they are, and they are the biggest and the most attractive part. One has to acknowledge that literature and cinema, or celebrity arising out of cinema, are rubbing shoulders there. And these celebrities they're invited not only to speak on cinema, they can, once having become a celebrity, you can speak on anything. You become an oracle. You become an authority on almost every subject in the world. That's the function of celebrity. Earlier, literary people could do that. Now, cinema celebrities can also do that and can do it even better. Now, one other factor that I wish to introduce, that's so far as cinema's place in society is concerned. The evolution of that place from the 1930s up to the 1990s, up to the present state, right up to date. That's how it's evolved. One other factor that I wish to mention is also both in earlier it did not work in favor of cinema, but now I think it does. And for all viewers, it is a very important factor, which is cinema is far more easily accessible. Watching a film is not half the work as reading a book. And that is why, all over the world, not only in India, when literary classics are being talked about and polite conversation turns to asking each other if somebody has read the novel, a famous novel, the answer is quite acceptable that if somebody says, well, I haven't read the novel, but I've seen the film. More and more, this is the answer and this is the acceptable answer. It's like a student saying, I haven't read the text, but I've read the Kunji. This is easy access in many ways to what is supposed to be classics, what is supposed to be relatively hard work, but there's also a shortcut to it. But even when it's not in it's not an adaptation of a literary work, what does cinema do? Cinema is not only easily accessible, cinema is extremely persuasive. Unlike literature, cinema gives us the illusion that what we are watching is actually happening. Literature never can do that. It can do that indirectly, but it needs our participation at an imaginative level, sympathetic imaginative level, to be able to accomplish that. In cinema, it begins to happen as soon as the film begins. It's actually happening before our eyes. It's very difficult to believe that it's only fiction. Earlier, cinema was thought to be true. It had a truth claim in the same sense that history has a truth claim or used to have a truth claim. What you're watching before your eyes cannot be untrue. And even now it applies, for example, to news report every day on television. The camera does not lie. That's what used to be said. That was the sutra. But now we have come to realize through greater awareness that the camera is lying all the time. The first lie is, what does it choose to show? And what does it not show? Where does it focus? I think all of us are getting better aware, more sensitive to the manipulation of the visual image in a way that we were earlier to the manipulation of the literary word. So this truth claim, this veracity claim, and easy accessibility, that has a kind of deep appeal to all viewers. Some people were, in the beginning, this was viewed not only with admiration, but also with suspicion, especially with thoughtful people, as I've just pointed out. There is a novel called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's a dystopian novel. It shows you what terrible things will happen in future. And one of the things that happens in that novel is that movies have just been invented. Talkies have just been invented. From movies, the medium has moved on to talkies. Earlier, we had silent films. Now we have films where people talk and people behave as ordinary human beings do. We can hear them saying things. Aldous Huxley projected that the next stage of technical development in cinema would be that we would have feelies. Movies, talkies, feelies. What are feelies? That whatever we watch in cinema, we would not only see and hear, we would also feel the same thing. That if the hero is feeling some particular emotion or some particular sensation, we would also feel the same. It's very easy to extend this. If the hero is being tortured, we'll feel the torture. If the hero is kissing the heroine, we'd also be kissing the heroine. This is the projection that Aldous Huxley made in that novel, Brave New World, in 1932. As soon as the talkies come in. I mean, in India a bit later, in the West a little bit earlier, not much earlier. So this is also, of course, an extension, a parodic extension, a parody, a caricature. It still hasn't happened. They still don't have feelies. We have 3D, but we don't have feelies. There are some statements by writers now, very sensitive writers, great writers, now, in more recent times, acknowledging the great reach of cinema, the great appeal of cinema, and these are envious statements. These are statements suggesting that writers realize, even the best of novelists realize, that they cannot reach where cinema can reach. V.S. Naipaul is remembered for saying time and again that the novel is dead. He kept saying that, and he kept writing novels. There's a little paradox. But he was right, that the novel is dead. He was at least partly right, that the novel as a literary form has exhausted its potential, has reached its peak, and is perhaps in decline. What did he also say that is not highlighted so much? He said that if he was a young man all over again and he was beginning his career now meaning in the 1990s, 2000s, he would want to be a writer for cinema. He would want to be writing scripts for cinema. That is the more effective medium. That is also perhaps a more artistic medium, artistically effective medium. I'll give you one more example. Salman Rushdie, for example. It has always been Salman Rushdie's great dream, beyond the great success that Midnight's Children has had. And only yesterday he came out with a piece himself celebrating 40 years of the publication of Midnight's Children, published exactly 40 years ago. And it has grown from fame to greater fame all these years. He wanted for a very long time to have a big film made out of Midnight's Children. And for many, many years, it did not happen because he knew that that would be even greater success than the novel has achieved. And it has finally happened, but not in the way that he thought. There is an essay by Salman Rushdie on a film which came out at about the same time as Midnight's Children, the novel came out. And it is full of very sharp criticism. And I think that very sharp criticism of that film arises out of envy. That film is also about India, and it succeeded and gave an even more persuasive version of India to the West and to the world at large than even Midnight's Children could. What is that film? Gandhi by Attenborough. Midnight's Children came out in 1981. Gandhi, the film, came out in 1982. And if we put the two together, we would see how persuasive each was, how far each of these reached, each of these works of art reached, the kind of influence that each of them had on the image of India in the whole world. And as I said, Rushdie's piece on Gandhi drips with envy, I think. And that's why he finds fault after fault with it. So this is part of what films are beginning to do to us. This is part of how the equation between cinema and earlier forms of literary production, literary narration. What do films and literature and novels have in common? They are the basic form of narrative that is offered to us. That is how to tell stories. There are two alternative ways of telling stories about ourselves. There are some things that the cinema cannot do, and which the novel has been doing pretty well. But I think that one of the reasons that we don't even notice them is that all of us watch films, all of us enjoy cinema, and very few of us have had actually any kind of training or development of sensitivity as to how to watch a film, as to what a film is composed of. And that is also because the cinema has very easy appeal to us, immediate, easy appeal to us. We are entranced by it. It is a Maya lok. It is an illusion that works perfectly. And therefore, we do not stop to examine just how it works. Everybody watches films. And yet, I don't think many people notice when one shot begins and it ends and the next shot begins. I don't think many people notice the point of view of the camera. I don't think many people notice what the focalizer is. These are ways in which cinema is used. These are artistic devices in which cinema achieves the kind of effects it wishes to achieve. And I think what we need to go with the greater popularity of cinema, the greater appeal of cinema, is some kind of technical training, if you like, artistic training. I mean, people who read literature, especially people who read poetry, need a lot of training in how to read literature. And the more training you have, the more you get out of that art form, the more meaningful it becomes for you. And I think the stage has come, it certainly had come a long time ago. I mean, there are disciplines called film studies, but they're still not prospering to the same extent as more traditional disciplines had. And I think we need to make room for that. I know that many literature departments have been doing that, including in Delhi University and other universities too. But some kind of appreciation of the nitty-gritty of the art of cinema is necessary. Finally, I would go back to what Gyantoshji was saying right in the beginning. What is happening right now, what is happening in this refresher course, is also a form of cinema. Over the last year, since Corona came in, many changes have taken place. What used to be called distance education has now become normal education. So many teachers are teaching from homes, and so many students are sitting at home and listening to them. And this Corona-induced development marks a new stage in the history of cinema, the cinematic medium, and the history of its impact on society. This is something that we need to recognize. We've taken to it out of necessity, out of dire emergency, as it were, because we could not be close together as in the old classroom. But I think we're not fully aware of what we are doing and what we have done. And I think this in itself can be a subject of study. To put it in one kind of way, all teachers have become film stars. All teachers have become aware of the kind of image they project. All teachers have chosen a certain kind of angle in which to speak to their students, certain awareness of lighting, apart from the content, of course. The content remains what it was. It has also to be altered, I think, to the new medium to some extent. So this kind of ubiquity of the cinematic medium, not only in society, but specifically in the service of education. This has, as the medium of education, this has happened only over the last year or so. And I think we need to refine the practice to become more self-aware of this practice and to see how we can best use it, because this spread of cinema everywhere. I mean, earlier people used to say only rickshawalas go to Hindi films. Now nobody needs to go to any films. Films are there in your palm, in your mobile. One can be watching it all the time anywhere. Hasta malakuvat. There's a phrase in Sanskrit that the whole world is for you like an avla. Amla in some other languages, that little fruit supposed to be full of healthy things, and you hold it in your hand as if you're holding the whole world in your hands. That is what a mobile projection of the image has done through the mobile phone. That is the availability, and specifically the use of the cinematic instrument, medium, in the cause of education is going to have very far-reaching effects. We are all part of it. We are all complicit in it, if you like. And we all, as I said, need to grow a greater awareness of just what's happening, or how we are going to lead our lives in what is supposed to be the normal sense from here on. Thank you very much. Is anyone listening? I said, thank you very much. I finished.
Yes, sir, we are listening. We are
Yeah,
listening,
right.
sir.
Okay. I
We
needed
were
another
just
word.
engrossed in what you were saying. It was a very nice.
Yeah.
Priyanka, are you there? Priyanka?
That's another effect. While you pretend to be listening, you can be doing anything else.
So we remained spellbound for total
I'll
out
believe
the
you.
period. Yeah, yes, sir.
Please take go. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for the stimulating keynote address. And in fact, you have given us such valuable ideas to appreciate literature, cinema, as well as life. And as all the three are intricately integrated. And we are extremely grateful to you for taking out the time for this important event. I think the formal address will be given by Priyanka. Priyanka? Thank you very much, sir, for appreciating our efforts and for supporting the initiative taken by ARST College in undertaking this refresher course on the theme of literature, society, and cinema. And we are in awe of your great scholarship and expertise. And I'm sure our participants are going to discuss the various inputs that you have shared on the theme with us. And it has been a truly memorable morning. And we are greatly benefited by your historicizing of Indian cinema, the advent of Indian cinema, and also how there is an interface between theater and cinema, and the whole gender aspect of it. The way courtesans, the female performers have been, looked at, and how paradoxically they were so crucial to the to the field of performing arts, and yet they were degraded and were not given the rightful position. So we are grateful for all these valuable ideas, and we look forward to having more enlightening sessions with you. And we hope you can join us again in better times. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Yep. At the end, or are there going to be questions?
Sir, ideally, there's no question answer round after the keynote address, but I would request our participants, if they have anything to share or if they have any observations to make, they can raise
I
their
think there are some questions in the chat box. You can see there, but although it's not questions, these are some addition.
Yeah, I don't mind if there are, I mean, keynote is only a word. I mean, if people are interested in raising some points and asking questions,
There is,
I'll be
I'm
happy
taking
to.
up,
Yeah.
with your kind permission, I would like to take up a few observations that our participants have posted in the chat box. This is Dr. Rachita Koldhar, and she writes, how do you think social media like Netflix has changed the entire cinematic experience for audience?
Yeah, I don't think it has changed it entirely. It has made a very substantial change. It has further, one has to pay for it in a way that one doesn't have to pay at the same amount for regular television. I mean, there's Doordarshan that one doesn't have to pay for, the commercial channels that one has to pay for. On top of that, one has to pay extra for Netflix. So what we're doing is we are taking this medium more and more. We're making it more choice-based. We are introducing variety, but at the same time, we are underlining the increasing affluence of a certain segment of our society, which is able to enjoy these facilities. What it has done further is you can watch things on demand, as it were. They do not have every film that you wish to watch. That's been my experience. They do not have the kind of films, many films that I would like to watch, but they have lots of films that they are pushing at me, asking me to watch them anyhow. Because those are the kind of films that perhaps are popular even in that segment of people. It was already available on YouTube. Many of these, it's not, Netflix is not radically new. But on YouTube, there was what there was. Here, they're adding to it all the time. And much of it is not only new, it's been made specially for Netflix viewers. That, I think, is the big difference.
Yeah, moving ahead, I would like to take up a question from Aisha Varsi, who would like to know if there exists an interpretive community similar to the one that exists in reading and understanding the artistic elements of a literary text.
You know, we need to develop it. As I said, there's a lot of very good work that's already been done. The work began with trying to compare it with literature. Naturally, because as I said, there was almost an umbilical cord between them. Or, I mean, they were like as in the films, twins separated at birth. So they had to be found, they had to be related to each other. And there's lots of people who were genuinely interested in cinema felt that one of the early purposes of all cinema discourse was to contradistinguish it from literature, to say how it is not literature and how it works differently. And that, I think, is very important indeed. As I said, I mean, if we know what a shot is, if we know what a counter shot is, if we know what the meaning is of a shot taken from, as they say, over the shoulder, how do we show dialogue? In cinema, there is no difficulty depicting a dialogue between two persons talking. There's no problem. Here, you cannot show both the persons except in alternating shots. If they're standing face to face, you can't show both facing each other at the same time. It's a basic limitation of cinema. So you have to be cutting from one shot to another. How do you show a flashback? In cinema, in a novel, the tone changes. Sometimes in a language like Hindi, the gender changes. So there is an awareness constantly while a flashback lasts that this is not part of the main chronological frame of the narrative. In cinema, it looks just the same as all the other frames. I'm not only pointing out what the cinema cannot do. Let me also point out what the cinema can do. Once I wrote an article, I've written 3 or 4 articles on cinema over the years. One was on the evolving language of Hindi cinema. Hindi, Urdu, Tapodi, Bambaiya, Punjabi, all these, English, all these coming into it and playing different roles. But the instance that I remember is showing something that a novel could not, and was based on a novel. The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri is one of the very few novels I've read which are good, and the film is equally good, if not even better. There's a prejudice on the part of people like me to say that the novels are always better and the films are always worse. It's not true. There are many exceptions. And that's because films can do what novels cannot sometimes. In this case, there is this woman who is married to somebody already working in the USA, the Bengali woman. She has to go and make a new home in the USA. She feels quite alienated. She doesn't know the language. And her great emotional refuge are the letters that she writes home to her mother. Now, in the novel too, she writes letters home. Now, I'm watching her in the film writing a letter to her mother. And she sits down at the table, and in this scene, she begins to write. And what does the camera show? The camera has a close-up of that particular piece of paper, and there slowly begins to emerge on it a line in Bengali. The film is in English. Now, this is something that has a very powerful effect in the novel, it's not even stated, I think, that the letter is in Bengali. She is writing to her mother, so naturally it might be in Bengali. But when you see it being written in Bengali, the impact of the visual stays with you. That this is something that this young woman is holding on to from India while she's staying in the United States. These are the kind of touches of vividness and immediacy that the cinema brings to you. Another thing, while I'm about it, let me mention another thing that works both ways. In many novels, the novelist does not feel any obligation to make the heroine particularly attractive. Or she is made attractive, but not in an immediately physical manner. In Umrao Jaan Ada, for example, film is called Umrao Jaan, not Ada. Ada is the poetic pseudonym, takhallus, of this woman. What it emphasizes in the novel is that she is not only a dancer and a singer, she is a poet, which is very rare in courtesans. That is dropped in the film anyhow. But in the novel, it's made very clear that in that kotha, which has several women, young women, Umrao is not the most beautiful. It is the daughter of the lady who keeps the kotha, who happens to be the most beautiful, physically, the best looking, but she has no other accomplishments. She certainly is not a poet. Now, in a visual medium like the film, I think is partly the commercial consideration that makes people choose, directors and producers choose absolutely the most beautiful woman that they can find in order to play the role of the heroine. Now, this is what Premchand called the commercial consideration. And it continues. I'm hearing many sounds. Can we mute some people?
Participants are requested to mute themselves.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, it's much better. Any other
Yes,
points?
yes, yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us on this very critical relationship between literature and cinema, and also the way literary adaptations have worked, and this very interesting example of Umrao Jaan Ada. You know, what it has happened to, you know, on the cinema, on the screen. We would definitely like to explore it, and our honorable speakers, you know, in the course of the 2 weeks time, I think are going to explore it further, and it would be a great deal of interest to all of us. सर, एक प्रश्न डॉक्टर राजेश कुमार पूछना चाहते हैं, क्या सिनेमा ने उपन्यासों को अपदस्थ कर दिया है?
ये राजेश कुमार का एक और सवाल मुझे दिख रहा है कि सिनेमा में गुलशन नंदा की सफलता और प्रेमचंद की असफलता को आप देखते हैं। राजेश जी, आपके प्रश्न से स्पष्ट हो गया कि आप इसको किस रूप से देखते हैं। देखिए, ये एक सबसे बड़ी बात क्या है, सिनेमा और साहित्य का सबसे बड़ा फर्क क्या है कि एक उपन्यास लिखने के लिए एक आदमी अकेले एक छोटी सी कोठरी में बैठ सकता है और उपन्यास लिखना शुरू कर सकता है और उपन्यास लिखना समाप्त कर सकता है। फिल्म इस तरह नहीं बनती। फिल्म में लाखों करोड़ों का खर्चा आता है। एक फिल्म बनाने में 20, 50, 100, 150, 200 लोगों की भूमिका होती है, तरह तरह की, न केवल स्क्रीन के सामने लेकिन पीछे भी तरह तरह के टेक्नीशियन होते हैं, उनको तनख्वाह देनी पड़ती है, पैसा जुटाना पड़ता है प्रोड्यूसर्स को, फिर लगाना पड़ता है, उम्मीद करनी पड़ती है कि फिल्म चलेगी। तो ये शुरू से ही ऐसा रहा है, इसलिए ये दोनों विधाएं काफी फर्क हैं। और गुलशन नंदा ऐसा नहीं है कि फिल्म में ही सफल रहे। गुलशन नंदा लेखक के रूप में, उपन्यासकार के रूप में भी उन्होंने वही तत्व अपनाए। You know, there's a very interesting anecdote about Gulshan Nanda that I wish to narrate to you. This is in the 1980s. There was a comparative literature conference in Delhi, and a professor came from China. Then we did not know too much about China. There were not too many exchanges. He told us that the Hindi novelist most widely translated in China was Gulshan Nanda. So we asked him, how did it happen? In China, then, even now, I think, the state decides, the government decides which foreign writers will be translated, how many copies will be printed, at what price, and so on. It's all state controlled. So the government decided that rather than translate people like Bankim or Sharad or Tagore or Premchand, they will translate Gulshan Nanda in a very big way. And the answer at that time seemed to be behind the explanation behind this, that Gulshan Nanda depicts certain aspects of Indian society which are quite titillating, which from a communist point of view seem quite corrupt. And this is the image of India that the Chinese government at that stage wished to project. And therefore, he's ideal for this purpose. There are many views, there are many possible views that one can have on what popular writers do and how they are to be read and consumed. Yes?
Yeah. So there's another important observation by
Shubha?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes?
I'm taking the last question by Aisha Varsi. Sorry, not Aisha Varsi, Amit Kumar.
Yeah.
Sir, with your point on the appeal of cinema and literature, don't you think the very appeal of cinema to the masses has in a way affected the ways in which we make sense of the world? I think I've already taken.
Oh, yeah, certainly. You know, make sense of the world is a very big phrase. We make sense of the world in so many different ways. One of the things that is very difficult to show in cinema, even in art cinema, is to have a character sit down and think long and hard. Because nothing is happening on screen. He's just sitting there, and however wonderful a facial expression he puts on, it's not likely to change. And even if he holds it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that's not going to be a successful cinema shot. In literature, one can contemplate the world, any character, for a very long time. 5 pages, 8 pages, 10 pages, just contemplation, things that he's not saying to anyone. He's just thinking about within himself. Now, how do we make sense of the world? We make sense not only through literature, not only through reading books, not only through watching films, but also by then having had those experiences, artistic experiences, if you like, after having those experiences, sitting down and thinking about them, mediating them through our own imagination, through our own moral sensibility, through our own ethical, aesthetic sensibility as to what we have seen and what does it mean to us and what should it mean to us, how should it broaden our sympathy, how should it arouse, if you like, compassion, how should it refine our sensitivities. That is how we make sense of the world. You know, whatever inputs we receive from direct experience of the world or from representations of the world through aesthetic media like literature, like film, like dance, like painting, whatever, that has to be mediated. That has to be filtered through us, through our sensibility, to whatever our sense of the world is ultimately.
There's one more question that has caught my attention, and probably it would be useful for all of us to hear your views on this. This is Dr. Priyam Barua Deepak. She wants to know, can we call women's overt sexual presence in Bollywood cinema, which lies somewhere between the lavish dances and accessorizing the arm of a man, donning outlandish clothing and a personality both made with minimum layers, something as commodification of women or a kind of sexual confidence? Isn't it perceptionally paradoxical?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. What is paradoxical? What are the two parts?
Can we call women's overt sexual presence in Bollywood cinema, which lies somewhere between the lavish dances and
Yeah,
accessorizing the arm of a man, donning outlandish clothing and a personality, both made with minimum layers, something as commodification of women or a kind of sexual confidence? Isn't it perceptionally paradoxical?
yeah, right. You know, the commodification argument is very old. It doesn't begin with cinema. Women have been commodified for a very, very long time, have been subjected to male exploitation and male prejudice as a simple object of fleshly desire for a very long time. Cinema did not begin it. But cinema, with its immediacy, visual immediacy, was able to exploit it better than, say, literature. Because one can see, as Premchand wrote, nude or half-nude images. If you describe a nude woman in literature, if you show a nude woman in a painting, that's one kind of thing. It will still have an impact. But nudity as represented in cinema has a more direct appeal to the senses, and therefore its aesthetic appeal may be greater as well. But the degree of commodification may also go up in the same proportion. At the same time, this commodification has been turned around in feminist theory to say that it's a kind of a projection of sexual desire, female sexual desire as well, can be used as that. So it's not as if it's all pointing one way. It can be used in many different ways. It depends on not only the gaze, but the intent of the producer, the director, the actress herself. I'll give you one other little example that I noticed. Long years ago, I edited for Oxford University Press a novel by Thomas Hardy, Tess. Some of you may have read it or heard of it. It's about a milkmaid living in an English village. And a very famous art director, Roman Polanski, made a film of it. And I watched the film as well. And as soon as I saw the heroine, I was extremely unhappy. The heroine was a great award-winning actress. Otherwise, Roman Polanski would not cast her. Nastasia Kinski. She was cast as Tess. Now, all the descriptions that Hardy uses for Tess are that of a village girl who's actually a milkmaid who has to perform very hard tasks. You know, being a milkmaid is not easy. It takes tremendous physical effort, concentration to be a good milkmaid. Nastasia Kinski looks so slim and so thin as if she hasn't lifted even a book in her life. She looks ravishingly beautiful. But at the same time, you know, certain ideas of female beauty and projection can sometimes get in the way. They're not the only ideas. There are many possible ideas, but they can get in the way of characterization because the physicality of the character playing the role, it's so overwhelming sometimes that the role becomes secondary and the physicality becomes primary. This is a factor that is not only an impedance, it has also been exploited knowingly by some directors, by the whole business of cinema. It would be very liberating to have a whole succession of successful films in which nobody looks particularly attractive.
I know I'm taking liberty, but this is one question which Dr. Hardik Bhadeshia would like to ask. Sir, should censorship applied to OTT platform? If yes, then what will be the consequence for the creativity? And if it not, what will be the consequences to misguide the youth for nudity, violence, etc.?
You know, this is part of a larger question. If we have censorship for all other forms of visual performance and projection, then why should some forms be exempt? That's one question. Another more radical way another more radical way of putting this would be, why do we have censorship at all? There should be no censorship. But this is a much, it's not only OTT. What is difference in OTT is one thing. Should there be a segment of our society to which is what watches these programs, very small section, affluent, privileged, and so on? Should there be no censorship for them while there is censorship for the rest of the country? That is the heart of the question. Can money buy exemption from censorship? That's what we are looking at. But as I said, there is a larger question whether censorship is needed. And if it is needed, then should not the same rules apply to all kinds of projections of visual representation?
Sir, I think the thought-provoking lecture has encouraged our participants to ask more and more questions, and there are numerous messages thanking you for giving such a thought-provoking address, for such an enlightening presentation. And now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Priyanka Kulhari, my colleague from the Department of English, and also part of the organizing team, to give a vote of thanks. Priyanka, over to you.
Shubha. As Shubha said, on behalf of ARSD College IQAC, my teammates and all the participants, I would like to thank you, sir, for this enlightening session and for setting the tone for this whole refresher. Very nicely, very beautifully, with the help of references, you have told that how cinema used to be a villain in the life, in the movie of our life, and how it has come a long way and has become the co-star. So like very beautifully, you elaborated this whole journey, how the change come. And as is known that दृश्य हमारे मस्तिष्क पटल पर ज़्यादा गहरा असर डालते हैं, तो अगर हम सिनेमा को हमारी कक्षा में एक उसका उपयोग करना शुरू करें, तो मुझे लगता है कि हमारा पठन पाठन उससे और भी बेहतर साबित होगा. So once again, thank you so much. And thank you, participants, for being so energetic audience and taking interest and asking so many questions. Now there is time for lunch break, and we all will meet at 1:30 for our coming sessions. So please, it's a request, join on time, as we'll start exactly at 1:30. So once again, thank you, sir. Thank you so much, and thank you, audience. Thank you, participants.
Thank you, all of you, for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Wonderful to be with you and to share these ideas and to benefit from what you have had to say. I thought it's very nice of you to say that that cinema used to be a villain in our lives. You got the point perfectly. And now, what is it now? Is it a hero? One doesn't know. But yes, indeed, that is the kind of thing that we have to think about and take forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.